Hello and welcome everyone to EC 3030. So in this video lecture we will continue our discussion on the memory. So in this particular video lecture we will be talking about the flash memory technology, which is also the basis for solid state hard drives, and also we will talk about magnetic hard drives. So this is the memory hierarchy that we have been talking about in our discussion about the memory. So far we have seen SRAM and DRAM. So SRAM is the basis for registers L1, L2 cache, and DRAM is the basis for the main memory as well as L3 and L4 cache. So now we will be talking about the solid state hard drives or the magnetic hard drives, which is the basis, which is the technology that are used for the non-volatile storage or the secondary storage. So that's that. So now the floating gate memory or the flash memory. So usually this is the base. This technology is the basis for what we call the memory sticks, USB sticks, or the SD cards, as well as our solid state hard drives are based on this floating gate or flash memory technology. So the basic building block for the flash memory technology is a special kind of transistor called the floating gate MOSFET. Now by looking at it, you will see that the structure is very similar to that of a conventional MOSFET, except for the fact that there is an additional gate or a metal layer there. So basically there are two gates in this floating gate MOSFET. Now this floating gate here is separated from the channel by a thin layer of oxide. Usually this is very thin, so usually it's between 5 to 20 nanometers. And then from the floating gate to the top gate, which is called the control gate, there is a thick oxide over here, and you have access to the drain terminal. So this is the drain voltage VD, and this is the source, or the source terminal voltage VS, and then you have access to the control gate where you apply the gate voltage. You do not have an external access in general to the floating gate. And what usually is done is that by usually the way the data is stored in this floating gate MOSFET is by putting electrons into this floating gate over here. So we usually say that if there are no electrons there in the floating gate, then this floating gate MOSFET holds a data of 1. On the other hand, if there are electrons in this floating gate, then this device holds a data that corresponds to 0. So if data is 1 when there are no electrons in the floating gate, on the other hand data is 0 if there are electrons in the floating gate. Alright, so let's look into a little bit deeper into how a floating gate MOSFET works. So let's first look at the case when the floating gate MOSFET holds a data value of 1. Now in this case there are no electrons in this floating gate, so it doesn't have any electrons, no electrons in this floating gate, and in this case it will just work like a regular MOSFET. And for regular MOSFET we know that the IDVG curve looks like this, and this is the threshold voltage, and we call this threshold voltage as VT1. 1 represents the data value that is held in there. Now let's look at the case when the MOSFET holds a data that corresponds to 0. And in this case what we have said is that the floating gate has some electrons. So there are some electrons that are trapped in this floating gate. Note that these electrons are trapped in the floating gate, meaning that even if you turn off the power supply, these electrons will remain in this floating gate, and this essentially gives the non-volatile nature of the floating gate MOSFET or the flash memory technology, meaning that if you just turn off the power, these electrons will still be there, and as a result it will hold its data. Now what does this electron do? Now note that this is an n-type MOSFET because the semiconductor is p-type. So now if there are electrons in this floating gate, this will repel electrons at this oxide semiconductor interface. Again, these electrons will try to repel the accumulation of electrons at this oxide semiconductor interface. And what it will essentially do is that now if there are electrons in this interface, you will need to apply a larger amount of voltage to turn this oxide semiconductor interface from p-type to n-type. In other words, to reach inversion, now you will need to apply a larger voltage. And what it essentially does is it increases the threshold voltage. In other words, if it holds a data value of 0, there are electrons in this floating gate, and this floating gate electrons in this floating gate will increase the threshold voltage. So if the data value is 0, then the threshold voltage will increase from VT1 to VT0, and this one is corresponds to data value of 0, and this IDVG curve corresponds to data value of 1. Alright, so now how do we read the data from a floating gate MOSFET? And the way the data is read is very simple. Say you apply a gate voltage in the MOSFET which is somewhere between VT1 and VT2. Say this is the read voltage that you apply to the gate. So this is called V read. So now if you apply read voltage, and then a current will flow in, say the current that flows through the drain is ID. Alright. So if the data value is 1, then applying a V read voltage at the gate, so Vg equals to V read, if the data value is 1, you will measure a current through the device. In other words, in this case, because the gate voltage is larger than the threshold voltage, you will measure a sizable amount of current that flows through this floating gate MOSFET when the data is 1. On the other hand, when the data is 0, the Vg equal to V read is smaller than the threshold voltage of this device when it's holding a data value of 0, and as a result, in that case, the drain current that will be flowing through will almost be equal to 0. So in other words, when you apply a gate voltage to the floating gate MOSFET, then you apply a gate voltage at the gate which is in between the threshold voltages for data equals to 1 or data equals to 0, then the current that flows through the channel of this MOSFET, the current that flows between drain to source, will depend on the value that is stored in the floating gate MOSFET. And most importantly, this is non-volatile, meaning that even if you turn off the power, these electrons for data 0 will remain there even if you put the VDD to 0, and as a result you will always remember, this device will always remember if it were in a data value 0 state. On the other hand, if it's in data 1, there is no electrons, so even if you turn off the power and turn it on, there will be no electrons to begin with, so it will again give you a high current when you read it. Alright. So now how do we program or erase a floating gate MOSFET? Now programming means that you store the data corresponding to 0, and the way it is done is by putting some electrons in the floating gate or trapping some electrons into the floating gate. Now there are many complicated reasons as to why the programming happens the way I'm going to describe now. There are many complicated reasons, but we'll just give you a very brief overview of the programming. Again, programming means that you will put a data 0 into this floating gate MOSFET. So essentially you will put some electrons in this floating gate. Alright. So the way it's done is you apply a high voltage at the drain, the source is at 0 volts, and also the gate voltage is at a very high voltage. So what will happen is that a lot of current will flow in the channel, and due to a mechanism called hot electron injection, some electrons, so the current will flow in this direction and electrons will flow in this direction. So what will happen is that some electron will now jump across the oxide and end up in this floating gate. So by applying a large voltage at the drain and the gate, you trap some electrons into the oxide, and these electrons actually come from the semiconductor here, or the source and drain. Alright, so this is how you put electrons into the floating gate and program the floating gate MOSFET. Again, putting a data of 0 into a floating gate MOSFET is called programming. Now let's see how you do an erase operation. And what erase operation means is that you put a data value of 1. Okay. Now this essentially means that if there were some electrons in the floating gate, you will remove those electrons. Okay. So in this case, what is done is the source, first of all, is now not connected to the ground, rather it's left open or floating, and then the same drain voltage of high voltage, for example 12 volts, is applied to the drain, and the gate is now changed to 0 volts. Okay. So now if you apply such a large voltage to the drain and 0 voltage to the gate, what will happen is that these electrons will disappear. So say you have some electrons over here, and these electrons will disappear from the floating gate. So these electrons will disappear from the floating gate, and this is how you put a data value of 1 into a floating gate MOSFET. Now eraser essentially means that you put a data value of 1, and programming means that you put a data value of 0 into the floating gate MOSFET. Alright. Now note that only by an eraser operation you can change the electrons, you can remove the electrons from the floating gate. Removing the power supply voltage or putting the power supply voltage to 0 volts do not remove the electrons from the floating gate, and essentially that gives rise to the non-volatile nature of the floating gate MOSFETs. Okay. So as we said, the floating gate MOSFET is the basis for the flash memory technologies, all the USB drives, USB sticks, SD cards, as well as solid state hard drives. So now what you can clearly see is that the flash or this floating gate memory technology is more area efficient than SRAM and DRAM. The reason is very simple. DRAM is one transistor, one capacitor, and SRAM is at least 6 transistors, while flash is a simple one transistor device, and as a result it's more area efficient than both SRAM and DRAM. On the other hand, it happens so that the speed is actually much slower than both SRAM and DRAM, and the reason is that the program and eraser, these are very slow processes. Putting electrons into the floating gate or removing electrons from the floating gate is a slow process, and that essentially means that the flash is a slow device, is slower than both SRAM and DRAM. And in terms of non-volatility, flash is non-volatile while SRAM and DRAM are volatile. And this is because if you turn off the power, then all the voltages in the DRAM will go to 0, and also all the voltages in the SRAM will go to 0, so it will not remember what the previous value was. On the other hand, these electrons that are trapped in the floating gate will remain even if there is no power supply. Alright, so now let's look into magnetic storage devices or magnetic hard drives. So in a magnetic hard drive, the storage element is the orientation of the magnetic domains. So for example, here what is being shown is a simple bar magnet. Now a magnet has two poles, the north pole and the south pole, and say this also represents, say for example, a magnetic domain. Now if the orientation of this magnetic domain is like this, such that the magnetic dipole moment is from bottom to the top, let's say this represents a data value of 1. On the other hand, the opposite orientation of this magnetic domain represents a data value of 0. Now what happens in a magnetic hard drive is that there is a platter, and that platter is coated with a magnetic material, and in this magnetic material there are many magnetic domains like this which are which exist side by side like this, and the data values are encoded in the orientation of these magnetic domains. Now the key to the high density of magnetic hard drives, meaning the data storage density of magnetic hard drives, is high, and the reason is that these domains can be as small as 10 nanometers, and this is essentially why the storage densities in magnetic hard drives can be very high, meaning that they are very area efficient compared to SRAMs, DRAMs and flash. Alright, so this is how a magnetic hard drive looks like. So this is a diagram of a magnetic hard drive. So now this is the main element, the platter over here, and this platter is coated with a magnetic material, and the domains in this magnetic material essentially encode the information. So this platter rotates. Now there is what is used to read and write the data into this magnetic layer is the head, and the head is mounted on an actuator arm. So this actuator arm can move like this, and also the actuator can go a little bit up and down so that it can come in contact with the magnetic hard drive, magnetic domains to read and write them. Alright, so now this is a photograph of a magnetic hard drive platter. The platter is this one, and then this is the head, and this is a close-up image of the head. So this head is essentially used to read and write into the platter, in the magnetic material in the platter, and these images are taken from Wikipedia. Alright, so now let's see how the read and write happens in a magnetic hard drive. And for this particular example, what we have assumed is that the orientation of domains are perpendicular to the plane. Now there can also be the case where the domains, rather than being perpendicular, they're in plane, meaning that they can be like orientation like this. Okay, so now let's try to understand how the writing happens in a magnetic hard drive. So this is how the head looks like. For writing, what the head does is that it creates a large magnetic field which is concentrated at the tip of this, Now say you want to write a magnetic domain like this domain into this orientation. So what you will need to do is apply a current that flows through this electromagnet or the coil over here, and it will create a magnetic field like this. And so the current that flows through the coil has to be in the right direction such that the magnetic fields are along this direction. Now the highest concentration is here, so this magnetic field will orient this domain in this direction. All right. On the other hand, say you want to put this domain over here into the other orientation, the orientation like this. In this case, you will have to now flow a current in the opposite direction through this coil such that the magnetic fields are like this, and in this case a high magnetic field is created in this domain region, and as a result this magnetic domain will be oriented like this in this case. Okay. On the other hand, the same head can actually read the orientation of the domain, and the way it does is when it comes close to this domain while reading, it can either sense the magnetic field that is created by the domain, or it can read the orientation of this domain by a physical mechanism called giant magnetoresistance. So either way, there are a lot of details as to how the read is done. So but for now, what we need to know is that you can either sense the magnetic field of the domain, or you can use a phenomena called GMR, giant magnetoresistance, to read this thing. Okay. Another important thing is that same head is used for read and write. All right. So now let's look into how the data is read from a magnetic hard drive and what is it that the access time depends on. So first thing to note is that the platter is, so this is the platter, this solid line represents the boundary of the platter, and this platter is divided into multiple tracks. So a track, these tracks are concentric circles. Now each of these tracks contains several sectors, and what is important is that these the read happens sector wise. So the read mechanism is sector wise read. So if you want to access some data, for example this data over here, you will have to read the entire sector. Now another important thing is that the magnetic hard drives are not random access memories. In random access memories, irrespective of the physical location of the data, the read and write times are the same. Wherever the data is, the read time or the write time will be the same. It does not depend on the physical location of the data. On the other hand, for magnetic hard drives, the amount of time that you will need to access a certain data in a certain physical location will actually depend on the physical location of that data. So to understand that, let's do some quick calculations. Now let's say currently the head is over here, so this is the current location of the head, and say you want to read the data that is over here. Okay, so then what you need to do is you need to first move the head from this track to this track, and for that the time that you need to the time required for the head to move from this location, this track to this track, is given by capital T sec, and this is equal to n multiplied with small letter t sec. And what is n? N is the number of tracks that you need to traverse to go from the initial track to the second track, and t sec is the amount of time that is required to move the head from one track to another one. All right, so this capital T6 is the time required to move the head from the initial track to the desired track. Okay, so now once you are in this track, then how much time you need to rotate the platter or the disk such that the head, so that this desired location comes to this location of head. So essentially you need to rotate the disk such that it comes here. Okay, so say R is the rotational speed of the platter and S is the number of tracks in there, and N sub R is the number of sectors that needs to be traveled. So the amount of time required such that the desired sector location comes under the head is the T rotational, and this is given by NR over R multiplied with S. Alright, so once the desired sector comes in under the head, then you need this amount of time TRW, T read write, to read the entire sector. Okay, so the total access time is the sum of all these three times: the seek time, the rotation time, and the read time. Okay, so now you can clearly see that depending where the head is and depending on where the physical location of the data is, the access time will vary. Again, the access time or the read time will depend on the physical location of the data as well as the physical location of the head. And you can imagine the worst case scenario. So in the worst case scenario, the initial location of the head is here and the data that you want to read is say over here. So for that, the head needs to move from here to here, or other way around if the initial data is here and the desired data is over here. So the head has to move between the opposite sides of the platter, and then the head may need to wait almost a full rotation such that the desired sector becomes available. So say for example your initial location is here and then your head moved here, but the desired location was here, so the entire rotation, so or maybe the desired data was here, so the entire disk had to make a full rotation such that this sector comes under this head. Alright, so just to give you an example of a hard drive characteristics. So for example here the Hitachi Ultrastar, the data density is 285 gigabit per inch square, the rotation speed is 72 rotations per minute, and the access time may be as high as 8 milliseconds. Alright, so finally a comparison between magnetic hard drives and all the other technologies. So the most important characteristics of the magnetic hard drive, as we have said, is that the density is extremely high, and the reason essentially is that the size of the magnetic domains can be as small as 10 nanometers, the radius can be 10 nanometers, which is actually smaller than all the other cells for SRAM, DRAM and flash. Okay. So as a result, the density of magnetic drive, density of data storage for magnetic hard drives or the magnetic technologies are extremely high. This is the highest. On the other hand, the speed is extremely slow. As we have seen, the access time can be as slow as 8 milliseconds. So this is much slower than all the other technologies. And of course, magnetic hard drives are non-volatile, and the simple reason is that there is no concept of voltage in the magnetic drives, because the data is stored in the orientation of the magnetic domains, and the magnetic domain orientation will remain there irrespective of the power supply voltage, because the mechanism is completely different. It's not charge based, rather it's magnetic domain based. All right.